Welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain the purpose of the item ban list me and several other hosts used for our private matches. Explain a little bit about the history of item abuse and item regulation in this game, and discuss the problem of self-restraint. Many players know that there is an item ban list, but it seems that the exact reasons for these item bans' existence was lost on many players. To start with, let's discuss the need for the private match item ban list. For the newcomers who weren't aware, this game's PvP essentially was put on life support when PvP seasons were removed around May last year. PvP completely died on all platforms until several of us on PC banded together to bring it back to life. It took several weeks of recruiting and a ton of work to get the events up and running and maintain them. Unfortunately, the PvP population during this time was and still is tiny. For the last few months, we were getting around 14 participants max for any given day's PvP event. With a population that infinitesimally tiny, even as few as 4 or 5 people deciding within a short time span to stop attending our events would have been enough to kill PvP matches dead. Obviously, in a scenario like this, it becomes critical that we don't do anything that is going to drive away too many of our participants at once. And we also need to maintain a small stream of newcomers to replace those who did quit. Cryptic is notoriously slow at fixing items that became an issue in PvP over the years. Most of the time, we only got fixes if the item also happened to cause balance issues in PvE. This hasn't changed, and the result is that there are a ton of grotesquely overpowered items in this game that weren't designed with PvP in mind. Allowing too many broken item combinations to overlap in PvP, or permitting the most egregious items, makes conditions in PvP matches miserable for more players than we can afford to lose. In order to make it possible to continue to have PvP matches at all, the community had to take the regulation of these items into our own hands. Now onto the purpose of the private match item ban list. I occasionally see players who try to cry hypocrisy because we didn't ban every single overpowered item. Or they use the old X item we didn't ban is stronger than Y item we did ban argument. The important thing to understand here is that the item ban list was never intended to ban every single overperforming item in the first place. It would be impractical to try to ban all busted items, since it's also important to avoid making it too tedious for players to change to a PvP build. We also cannot remove all of the training wheel items without turning off too many of the newcomers. They need a basic amount of survivability and ways to be useful that don't require them to already be super experienced and skilled. The ban list wasn't intended to be a perfect metric of how strong an item is either. The real purpose of our item ban list was to cut down on the number and severity of overpowered items that can be used together at the same time, keep the match quality high enough for it to be desirable to keep coming to the events, and prevent PvP conditions from reaching an unplayable point. To an extent, the list also helps reduce how strong PvP builds can get, since it's also the case that running too strong of a build can kill the PvP queue right now. To an extent, the specific items that make their way onto the list were picked because it had to be something, and what works the best for keeping enough people playing is to ban the items that are deal breakers for a large chunk of the participants, alongside a few of the smaller items that were unnecessary quality of life downgrades. However, the ban list is by no means perfect. The item ban list had to be balanced with keeping the event simple enough to run smoothly. One example of this in action is the majority of the item bans are a one-size-fits-all approach, meaning most of the items on the list are banned for everyone regardless of circumstance. Ideally, we would take a more case-by-case approach for most of the item bans, where the host only asks a player to remove something if it would actually be an issue on them in particular. The reason it was done like this is because not everyone will understand or agree with a host allowing certain players to use an item and prohibiting the same item on other players. Few players are experienced enough to see how this all fits together, and a lot of people would just cry favoritism if we did that. This would require a lot of trust from the participants to pull off, and would be extra work for the hosts. More players would also try bickering with their hosts over why they should be permitted to use their preferred items, regardless of whether or not they actually should be using those items or not. Another example of this is that our ban list is, if anything, too lenient. There ideally would be more items on it, such as Flash Freeze Enchantment, Drowned Weapons, Mirage Weapons, etc. But again, we need to hit that sweet spot where players are still willing to go to the trouble. We needed to keep the list as small as we possibly could. You may be wondering about the items on the list themselves by this point. If you look at the text block on the screen there, those are the specific items that are on the ban list as of in Module 22. I will also explain exactly why each of these items got banned. First up, we have Soul Shield Enchantment. In Mod 22, this is easily the worst broken item in PvP. This is one of the two items that contributed the most to killing off the solo queue in Mod 22. Solo queue matches no longer happen on PC, and the use of this enchantment is a deal breaker for a large chunk of the players that play the private matches. The revive is currently bugged and has no cooldown, in addition to it healing you to full health. Every once in a while, Soul Shield doesn't revive you, but the majority of the time it does. The only time you can die while wearing this enchantment are the rare times when Soul Shield fails to revive you. I've watched players get up 3+ times in under 60 seconds thanks to this enchantment. Each time they get revived, their health bar is healed to full. Even when Soul Shield gets fixed, it will still be OP in PvP. There is no longer a good reason for Soul Shield to be allowed for anybody in PvP, since enchantments are all around the same price in Mod 22 and are hella cheap compared to what enchantments used to cost in the previous mod. You could still function in PvP right now with no combat enchantment on at all, even. Next up we have 3k damage dealing mount combat powers. This includes Tunnel Vision, Giant Toad Tongue Lash, and Golden Touch. All of these powers hit extremely hard in PvP, and are all ranged. The general consensus on these right now is that people die plenty without help from these easy mode powers. There are also several players that refuse to participate in matches when these powers are in use. These powers technically do result in 1 vs 1s between different classes coming out more balanced, but the catch is the fight quality drops to joke status. They also make conditions for new and undergeared players in side matches significantly harsher, which is bad for recruiting and player retention. One of the few pros to these powers is they can function as a useful damage supplement for players that don't do enough damage yet with their regular powers, such as undergeared barbarians. Notably, Toad is undodgeable for all classes except Warlock and Barbarian, and Tunnel Vision has a nearly instant cast time. The Toad combat power was also the second biggest contributor to the death of solo queue matches in Mod 22. It's been around for a while now, but a lot more people started using this power around the end of Mod 21. This was also a significant factor in causing solo queue match events to go into decline. Hosts started hosting more private matches, and weren't hosting as many solo queue events. This persisted in Mod 22. Rejuvenating Favor is the strongest self-healing power in PvP. It's a mount combat power. It heals you for a massive amount over a short period of time. It's easily more than 1,000,000 HP's worth of healing altogether. This power is a major concern when combined with sources of consistent damage, such as Band of Air. Those two items together, combined with a decent PvP build, results in Superman builds that can survive for an abnormally long time alone versus 3 enemies, while still being able to kill often. In testing, this was the case even for weaker classes, such as Barbarian and Rogue. We also tested this on Fighter. Even just by itself, Rejuvenating Favor is an excessively strong self-heal. The one pro to this power is that it could be a quick way for an undergeared player to supplement their survivability, until they get time to set up a proper PvP build. Rejuvenating Favor does have a minor weakness in that it doesn't allow you to peel for your teammates directly like Swift Golden Lion does. But you can still use it to indirectly improve your ability to appeal for teammates, such as putting enemies on the defensive by playing very aggressively with little risk of dying, or body blocking for teammates. Next we have Band of Air and Ring of Darkness. These items were first banned when they were new and were a lot stronger than they are today. The ban for Band of Air remained in place after it was nerfed, in part because this item is very grind intensive to get, and it can significantly alter the capabilities of certain builds and classes. It was safer just to keep Band of Air banned, but its effects are trending towards becoming more subtle, and a lot more people have them now. Band of Air may eventually be removed from the ban list, but more than likely Ring of Darkness will have to remain banned, unless its accuracy reducing effects get a massive nerf. Band of Air is a strong source of semi-consistent damage. It has around a 10% chance to proc, and those procs make a big difference in a PvP setting. It can be noticeable even in the hands of squishy PvE builds. It can throw off match balance in some cases and cause unusually large spikes in the number of kills they are capable of landing in a match setting. It can also make up a disproportionately large percentage of these players' damage output. Such PvE players had a mild negative effect on match quality with this ring on, but they were still at a manageable point. When Band of Air is applied to fully optimized, maxed out PvP builds on most classes, or simply good players on the strongest classes, it can significantly increase the effectiveness of those builds at winning matches, and can even change the strength of some classes in relation to each other. Rogue, for example, becomes stronger than Ranger would be wearing these same items. Those builds, to be fair, would be a problem even without this ring. Putting this ring on doesn't magically result in a player becoming too strong by itself either. It needs to be in the hands of a good player to become a major issue. Or it needs to be combined with specific items like the aforementioned Rejuvenating Favor. However, this ring still has a significant effect on how bad the ownage gets. It is noticeably more unpleasant to fight someone that has this ring on. Even when they have already hit the ceiling without help from this ring for how many match wins and kills they are capable of, in matches with low average player skill. Ring of Darkness overall is less powerful than Band of Air is, but in the situations it is OP in, it becomes a major issue. It reduces enemy players' accuracy by a very large amount. It is overpowered when used against the Ranger class especially, but would impact any squishy damage dealer that needs high accuracy in a similar way. Looking back on it, I should have banned everyone from using Ring of Darkness, due to the team synergy issues presented by it. While a tanky player or a healer isn't an issue running this ring by themselves. This could definitely become a problem when a player that is allowed to use this ring assists a DPS teammate that is not allowed to use this ring. AP and stamina drain overloads are banned due to them being completely unnecessary, combined with them having a negative effect on everyone's quality of life. Notably, they negatively affect shielding classes more than they do dodging classes. But in general, nobody likes playing against these items. These items become a bigger issue when a lot of people use them inside the same match, but are manageable and relatively easy to outplay when only a tiny number of people use them. Their effects can be reduced with wards, but the wards are impractical to maintain, and at least one of them doesn't fully negate the effect of its corresponding drain. They also are banned partly for historical reasons. Drains were the most hated item this game has ever had, and a majority of players on PC would prefer them to remain extinct. Believe it or not, drains did actually have a small pro in Module 21. When used against only the well-built fighters, believe it or not, drains did actually have a small pro in Module 21. When used against only the well-built fighters that chained their survival mechanics well. These drains could make those fights a lot more fair for weak. Believe it or not, drains did actually have a small pro in Module 21. When used against only the well-built fighters that chained their survival mechanics well, these drains could make those fights a lot more fair for weaker classes. This is because this fighter setup could completely stop their opponent from lowering the fighter's stamina preemptively by the necessary amount needed to kill them. Stamina drains made it possible for those weaker classes to kill the fighter at a reasonable success rate. However, the problem with trying to wear drains to counter fighters in matches is that you will inevitably end up hitting other players who are not fighters. So you'd basically be punishing everyone on the enemy team just to get back at 1 or 2 players. Holy Water was banned due to it being a 5-second long stun in PvP. It's a pretty obscure item not many people have tried to use, thankfully. Holy Water is primarily banned due to it being completely unnecessary and bad for conditions inside the matches. The only classes that had a justifiable reason to use this item were Undergeared Barbarians and Paladin in Mod 21. But this item was still pretty objectionable even back then, so we banned it for everyone. It's definitely not needed in Module 22. Crowd control effects lasting too long and overlapping too much is a rampant issue in Mod 22 as it is. Now to go over a little bit of the history behind item regulation and item abuse in this game over the years. This is PC's history, to make that clear. There were several factors that affected the likelihood of item abuse crackdowns succeeding or not. These were as follows. Number 1 was how united and powerful were the regulatory bodies that were attempting a crackdown. Number 2 was how widespread was the item they were attempting to crack down on. Number 3 was whether or not the item in question was mass perceived as being a must-have in order to compete or not. A very long time ago, there used to be several very large influential several very large influential guilds with active PvP populations. These guys banned their members from using certain items in PvP, such as Stronghold's AP and Stamina Drain overloads, and several of the overpowered rings from back then, such as Ring of Ambush, Ring of Cowardice, Stealth Revealing Rings, etc. On top of that, there were a lot of individual players who were firmly opposed to the use of these items. There was a very aggressive crackdown against AP and Stamina Drain users in particular. The end result was very few players were willing to keep using drains due to the backlash they kept getting for it. Drain usage went from being really common to being extremely rare because of this. One of the issues item abuse crackdown attempts frequently run into is how widespread an item is can make or break whether or not the PvP community successfully manages to crack down on it. There used to be a small window when an item first gets released where it was much easier for large guilds to successfully ban the item in question for their own members, and prevent a lot of outsiders from picking it up in the first place as well. Once too many people have it, most players will move forwards with the assumption that it is impossible to do anything about it, and it becomes part of the norm to start using it yourself even. Especially if too many of the PvP guilds didn't agree with each other on whether or not the item in question was OP and ban-worthy. Especially if too many of the PvP guilds didn't agree with each other on whether or not the item in question was OP and ban-worthy. There was some actual hypocrisy involved here. Within some of the more recent mods, such as Module 19, this problem reared its ugly head several times. All guilds in this game seem to be trending towards becoming less involved, especially when it comes to PvP matters. The PvP community as a whole on PC has been comprised of random individuals that have been mostly left to their own devices for years now. While that trend isn't all bad, it is certainly a mixed bag, and it undeniably makes it a lot harder to reduce item abuse in public PvP matches. This trend is also a clear indication of this game's declining health. Another factor in whether or not PvPers view a particular item as being a must-have in order to compete or not. Another factor is whether or not PvPers view a particular item as being a must-have in order to compete or not. If a majority of players believe that they must start using X item to counter or be able to compete with their peers, who have already started using X item, then they are a lot more likely to start using the item themselves, even when they despise the existence of the item and advocate for its removal from the game. If an item falls into a sweet spot, where it is well known that good players can outplay and outcompete someone using it, but the item is still an obnoxious quality of life downgrade, then it is a lot more likely to become one of the most hated items. Interestingly, items like this usually aren't the strongest items around, but they do still make PvP conditions significantly worse. Drains in more recent years definitely fall into this category. In short, PvPers are more likely to hate someone for using a weaker item that makes PvP conditions worse for no reason than they are to hate someone who uses the strongest items that are viewed as being a requirement just to get by. A player that picks up a reviled and wholly unnecessary item like this is perceived as being a lot more likely to be a selfish troll, or attempting to compensate for their lack of skill in the sleaziest way possible. Every now and then, a completely game-breaking bugged item makes its debut. When this happens, some players will find it amusing for like a week. Others hate it right off the bat. Either way, these items tended to be so absurd that they got fixed within the first few weeks of release. Our current day Soul Shield enchantment is following this pattern too so far. There is an additional layer to the stigma surrounding drains. Part of the reason why drains have retained their status of being the most hated item in PvP is because the PvPers remaining know that this was one of the precious few times an item abuse crackdown successfully drove a once common OP item to the brink of extinction. They don't want to see that get undone. It's one less unwanted item they have to deal with, and they will gleefully keep it extinct. Another common motivation for item abuse that rarely gets mentioned is when players felt the compulsion to test very questionable things inside matches. Players get curious and also want to see how strong they can make their builds. Such players didn't like using this stuff long term. Such players usually didn't like using this stuff long term, but still did so occasionally. This led to them essentially performing unethical experiments on the other match participants. Now to get into the elephant in the room here. How often was it actually necessary to use OP items in order to compete? If you've ever paid attention to your gut on the matter, chances are some part of you knows OP items aren't needed anywhere near as often as you tell yourself you need them. If it feels wrong, it probably is. That said, sometimes there is a strong case for you needing OP enough combinations of items to stay at the point where it is still possible to compete. You just don't need all of it, and in some cases you won't need any of it depending on your definition of OP items. As a little bit of psychological info, wearing all of the most egregious overpowered items or running the strongest possible version of a build can actually be counterproductive for competing and keeping yourself sharp. If your build makes you feel too comfortable, and you find yourself able to get away with making a lot of costly mistakes, chances are you aren't going to be going the extra mile for your gameplay anymore, even though you know you should. This is especially true if your build feels boring to play. This will negatively affect your motivation. Tanky builds also tend to be subject to this problem. Tanky builds need to be played aggressively in this game to get the most out of them, but it is very easy to find yourself slacking off due to the low risk of dying. In a nutshell, if your build is too powerful, it can have a very insidious effect on your motivation to continue playing your best, which can come back to bite you later down the road. The human mind seems to actively resist expending more effort than is actually required to accomplish a task. If you are trying to become the best of the best, this scaling laziness is not your friend. You ideally want to hit a sweet spot where you are powerful enough to surpass everyone you are up against, but are still required to be really lively and play well consistently in order to achieve that. Your build should feel exciting to play still, and you should still be getting punished for your mistakes. Another bit of important info is that in this game, it is a lot less likely for you to need everything in order to win competitions, because you would never be fighting anyone who actually has it all. Your opponent could put on all of the most powerful broken items in the land, but will still not be anything close to maxed out when it comes to their skill level. This makes it a lot more likely that you will be able to outplay and outcompete players without using anywhere near the same amount of broken items they used. This isn't the sort of game where a 1% difference is going to make or break you. The gaps between the players are all a lot larger than that. Now to discuss the problem of self-restraint. You may remember me saying earlier that PvP has been on life support ever since PvP seasons were taken out. There are community measures in place to prevent PvP builds from getting too strong. There are item bans, and many players deliberately go easy on new players to avoid scaring them off. Having a culture of self-restraint has been a matter of PvP's survival. Either we do these things, or there just wouldn't be any PvP matches anymore. Obviously, this isn't an ideal situation. And PvP would be heaps better if it was reasonably safe for everyone to play at our max potential and never hold back. Now this is where things get interesting. What if I told you PvP in this game never really left survival mode at any point in this game's history? If you look at the culture that developed around abstaining from using certain items and GG etiquette, you'll see that there was always some amount of self-restraint imposed upon PvPers in this game. This was both good and bad. It's definitely an indication of the poor health of this game's PvP, combined with some of the flaws of the human condition. The problems we face today have always been there, but they used to be a lot less prominent. Today we truly have hit the point where we either self-restrain or go extinct. But it could also be fairly argued that certain parts of this culture that were still present a long time ago were completely unnecessary back then. A major downside to having what can be described accurately as a shame culture is that it makes people feel guilty to go all out. This unfortunately extends to people's gameplay. Now make no mistake, it is a true statement that there is a real need to restrict some items in this game, and that some item combinations objectively worsen the quality of PvP inside the matches, regardless of what perception you have and what your tolerance is like. It is also a true statement that most players are oversensitive, and have always been oversensitive to minor annoyances looking at this game's history, and are prone to getting salty when they lose. It is human nature for people to try to shift the blame off of themselves more often than they should. New and inexperienced players, in all honesty, shouldn't have a problem with their opponents playing their absolute best versus them, or continuing to kill them throughout the entire match. This is an issue with inexperienced players historically taking the actions of experienced players way too personally, combined with the very real, unbalanced issues presented by this game's unfair PvP system. The two root causes of there being a legit need for self-restraint in this game is that this game heavily favors PvE content over PvP, and was never good at taking care of its PvP system at any point. The other part of it is human relations. A more free, totally lawless, shameless culture also has its pros and cons. A more free, totally lawless, shameless culture also has its pros and cons. Though I'd argue this other extreme is worse overall than the current organized shame culture is. It's also not possible to install without PvP first having a larger population, and PvP that is actually taken care of properly by the devs. A major issue with a culture like this is it coddles the feelings of and enables the unscrupulous players that take advantage of others, and the selfish, entitled people who have no problem screwing everyone else over. There are some players who just want to watch the world burn. And these boundary-stomping players cannot really be catered to without you becoming a total pushover in the process and causing more harm than good. On a closing note, I do think that the ideal thriving PvP culture would need to take a leaf out of the other side's book, though. More freedom and less restraint is the ideal. The pendulum has always been skewed too far in favor of a shame culture in this game, partly by necessity. But if the necessity issues ever got fixed, then we could make something much more satisfactory. That is everything, guys. See you next time.